attempting to create a water wheel simulation in Houdini today. So I'm going to open up Houdini, and the first thing we're going to do is make the water wheel rigid body, which is going to be interacting with the water, and we're going to make it procedural, meaning you can change the number of spokes it has whenever you want, basically. So what we're going to do, we're going to start off, going to come up here to the Create tab, going to click on Circle, hit Enter just to center it. Then I'm going to go over to this Circle Object node, double click to go into it. I'm going to put the divisions all the way up to make it nice and round. Then I'm going to hit Tab, and I'm going to type Group by, and it's going to give me Group by Range. So I'm going to click on that, put that underneath, I'm going to link that there. So now I've got this group node, and I'm going to change the group type to points because I want it to select the points around the circle. And the range filter, I'm going to get it to select 2 out of 4 points. So every second group of points around the circle, which you can see here, it's got 2 there, 2 there, 2 there, 2 there. So those are the points that's going to extrude outwards when we want to make the spokes. And so to do that, we're going to add another node. We're going to press Tab and type Transform, and put that underneath here, connect that there, make sure the visibility is on the Transform node. We can go up here to Group, go to the drop down and choose Group 1, which is this group here. Of course, if you call this something else, say Circle Points, when you go back to the Transform, you want to choose Circle Points. That's the first group, basically, and you just want that one. So then what we're going to do is we're going to go to Scale, and we're going to middle mouse click and drag, and that's going to drag out the spokes here. Now if we don't want to see all this mesh distortion, what I'm going to do is actually change the viewing mode to wireframe, and that way when we scale it up you see just that. So I'm going to make it quite big, just for the sake of being able to see everything. And then as you can see, this one here is abnormally large, and so what we want to do is go back to the circle and just decrease the divisions until it's the right size. Of course you can decrease it to none, which is pretty useless. The minimum you probably want to go is 3, I'd say, if you're making like a wind turbine. If you did 3, you could then go back to Transform and scale this up. Oops, that's shear. Scale it up even more, so you end up with a wind turbine sort of shape, but that's not what I'm going for today. I'm going to go for a water wheel type thing, so I'm going to go around 36, which is probably about good. In fact, I'm going to make them come out a little bit more. Okay, so once we've done that, I'm going to come back down here, press Tab, and type Poly Extrude. So that's basically going to extrude this mesh so that it gives it some thickness, basically. So I'm going to turn on the viewing for that, and I'm going to change the view back to flat wire shaded so that we can see everything. We want to scroll down and make sure Output Back is selected. I'll show you why in a second. So then we want to just change the distance, basically the thickness, and the slider only goes 1 both ways, but obviously you can go, if you wanted to go lots, you can go -5, you can type in whatever you want. I'm actually just going to go -3, I think. Yeah, let's go with that. Let's go with -3. And so the reason that you want to have Output Back selected is if you don't, it's a great big hole in the back. So basically it's the same principle as using end caps on a tube. So you want to have Output Back so that it closes it off and you've got a solid piece. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut a hole in the center here, and to do that I'm going to hit Tab, type Tube, put it just over here. I'm going to select end caps. You don't have to, but it's an aesthetic thing. If you want to be able to view both at the same time, you can simply click on the tube because you're using it, you're working on it, and put the view display on the extruded wheel thing. And so you selected the tube, you're going to go up to the orientation and have it on the Z axis, which turns it that way. And I'm going to pull down the radius scale so that it's inside that little bit there. I'm going to make it quite wide because then I'm going to put another one of these inside it in a second. So then what you want to do is that you can see that the tube only comes out one side, so you want to increase the height until it comes out both sides. What I like to do is just move the center of the tube towards the center of the wheel instead. Just otherwise you end up, you know, like that, and it just, I don't know, it looks ridiculous to me. So what I'm going to do is move it forwards on the Z axis. So move it 1. No, that's not enough. 1.5 maybe. Okay, so you can see it's coming through both sides now. You don't have to have it coming out any particular amount as long as it's just coming out, basically. Then we want to come back down here and hit tab and type boolean. And this node here is what's going to cut the tube out of this wheel. So you want to connect both to this boolean, and actually before you do anything else, go back to the tube and make sure the primitive type is set to polygon, and that'll make these edges all sharp again, but you can make that a nice round circle by increasing the columns. The reason we have to do that is it has to be a polygon to actually cut through. It won't work trying to cut a primitive shape. So we go back to the boolean and we can go union, and you can see that does nothing. Why? Because we're not displaying the boolean. So once we hit display on the boolean, which is the final node in the chain, you can see it cuts out completely. And you can play with all these settings here. Subtract A and B, or you could subtract B from A, which basically does the same thing, except in this instance it leaves the tube visible, which we don't want. So I'm just going to stick with union, and that way we've just got this wheel which is got a hole in the middle, kind of like a gear. Now what I'm going to do additionally, just to give it something a little bit more interesting to look at, is I'm going to select all of these nodes. I'm going to hit Control C to copy them, and I'm going to hit Control V to paste them again. So now I've got two, basically. So I've got display on this one, or this one. Now you notice no difference over here when I click, because they're exactly the same thing in exactly the same place. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to go to the transform here, and instead of putting the scale up like that, I'm going to pull the scale down, which is going to pull those spokes inwards instead. So I just pull them in nice and tight there. Okay, and then I'm going to turn that back on. And now you're thinking, okay, that's what's that all about? Well, then we go down here, press tab, type merge. I'm going to do a merge node. I'm going to input this boolean here, and display the merge node. And you're thinking that's still not quite right, and you'd be right in thinking that. So what we have to do next is go back to the transform, pull the scale inwards to create the spokes that we want, but of course we've still got that tube that's cutting through the middle, so we can just delete that. So I'm going to hold Y to cut this connection there. I'm going to delete this tube node because we don't need it, and then if I am not mistaken, if we click on poly extrude here, we can see that that bit is basically what we want inside the other bit. So we can also delete this boolean. So I'm going to cut that, delete that, and then connect that to the merge node, and then display on the merge. And now we've got the outer wheel and the inner wheel. Just gives it something, it just looks a bit more interesting. And you know, you can go even further with making it look interesting. So I'm going to come back to the poly extrude for this inner wheel. I'm going to make it a little bit less. I'm going to make it minus 2.5. So you notice no difference on that side, but on that side it's come inwards a little bit. So what we then want to do is create another transform node. Put it here. I'm going to connect it there. I'm going to cut this one, connect that one to the merge. So no difference there, but then when we go to the transform node, we can then translate on the Z axis towards the center a little bit more. And so you can see it's inset. The middle wheel is inset within the big wheel. So that just gives it, I don't know, it just looks a little bit more interesting. I like doing it. Okay, so that's and you can see these lines here. That's how even it is, and you can see it's not particularly even, so I'm going to try and make that a little bit better. Maybe 2.24, yeah, that's good. So that's roughly centered, and it doesn't really matter. It's not going to affect simulation too much. If the water is going to be on the outside, not going to be too much of an issue anyway. It's just an aesthetic thing. And so basically this, you can then press L and it'll just organize things a little bit more for you. And so that's basically, this is the object finished. So I'm going to go back to the object menu, and you've just got this circle object which you can then, you can move, you can scale, you can rotate. And so you've got this wheel which you can rotate, you know, however you like. Say, you know, at any point throughout doing this project you decide you want less spokes or more spokes. Simple, you just come back down to you come back into this node, into the circle, and just play with the divisions. And you know, you can change it to be as many or as few as you like. So I had it at about 36. And then for this one, same thing. Inside one, as many or as few as you like. I'm going to make that more. There we go. So that's pretty cool. So now onto the actual fluid tank. So I'm actually gonna press T and just move this up a little bit. In fact, I'm gonna move it up just completely out of the way because I just want to be able to see what we're doing down here. In fact, you can just turn off the display as well if you want. I'm just gonna leave it on. So then to make the fluid tank, we want to come up here to particle fluids and click on flip tank. And then I'm just gonna hit enter, which centers it basically. And so you'll see it'll create this small little tank of water, or tank of particles. Now you hit play, nothing much happens. You know, they sort of just sit there because they've got nothing interacting with them. And so you'll also notice that the reason that I left the visibility on this on is so that I can see how big I want the tank to be. So in order to change that, you want to go to fluid tank initial, and you got the size here. So I'm going to change the width to, let's say, 15, and length to 15. And now this box here, this outline box, this is the domain. So this is the boundaries of where the particles can move. So we want that to be a little bit higher. So we're going to change that to 15 as well. What that does is that basically triples the amount of space that I've got. So then what you can do is click on this and you can actually move that up so that there's less water but you've got more room. And you can change the water level reference. You can move it up individually, independently from the domain, sorry, if you want more, but I'd say that's probably enough. I'm only going to be putting the wheel sort of halfway down between, so I don't need that much room below, so that's probably okay. In fact, I can just have a look here and see, press L and it'll organize everything for you. Just gonna check and see if that's enough room. I only want it to be sort of like that, which is fine. You know, you can see there's plenty of room underneath, plenty of room on top. If you click on the fluid tank initial, you can see the domain, plenty of room for water to go flying up into the air. Okay, so then, most of the dynamics on the water are basically done once you click on flip tank. So then what you want to do is I'm going to rotate this. So I'm going to hit R to rotate. I'm going to set a keyframe at the beginning here by pressing Cat. In fact, before I do that, I'm going to go back into the circle. I'm going to go to the transform for the outside wheel, and I'm just going to make it bigger. Because I've got all this room at the bottom, and I want it to really make some waves. So I'm going to go back out. Okay, so I'm going to select the circle. I'm going to hit R. Sorry. Here we go, hit R to bring up the rotate tool. And then I'm going to hit K to set a keyframe here. And so you'll notice that these boxes all go green, which means that there is a keyframe. These values are locked in on this frame. So I'm going to move forward to, say, 120. And if it's taking a while, because it's calculating this tank as you scrub through. So if it's taking a while to do that, you can just press escape and stop it doing that if you don't want it to do that. So I've moved to frame 120. I'm going to hit R again, and I want to rotate this on the... So again, it'll slow things down if you've got the tank there. So you can just hit escape to cancel the calculation of the tank dynamics. So I'm going to rotate it on the Z axis. I'm going to rotate it 360 degrees, basically. Easy. Then I'm going to hit K, set a keyframe there. They'll all go green again, which means that value is locked in at frame 120. So if I go back to the start and hit play, you'll notice that, if the wheel turns, that's fine. But it's not affecting the water. So easy enough. All we do, select the circle, come up here, go to collisions, click on static object, and that just turns it into a rigid body that doesn't have any gravity acting on it. All it is a collider for other rigid bodies, and these particles were all dynamic rigid bodies. So if I go back to the start and hit play, you'll see that now it starts reacting, the water starts reacting to the wheel's movement. And the reason that the color is changing here, the ramp of colors is to, it represents the speed that they're moving, and the velocity. And you can change that, you can change the color, you can change what the color represents. I think if you go to fluid tank fluid and click on surface preview, okay, here we go. So the output here, you can change what the particles look like. So at the moment they're particles and compressed fluid surface. You can change it to surface polygons, which will basically give you this mesh where you can visualize what the water's doing. Now you probably don't want to do that if your computer's not too good. So I'm going to leave it as particles and compressed fluid surface. Also, in this surface preview menu, you can change the particle separation, which is the resolution of the fluid. So the lower this number is, the higher the resolution, because it means the particles are closer together, and because of that, when the mesh is created from the particles, because they're closer together, it's a more defined mesh, and therefore a sharper mesh. So you can change this to 1, and what it'll do is you'll notice the particles spread out a lot more. Then when you hit play, also making sure you have real time selected, when you hit play, you can see that they're well spread out, and it doesn't take quite as long to simulate because they're so far apart, and it seems as though there's a lot less of them. So I'm going to leave that at 0.25 because that's a decent resolution for right now anyway. When I render, I would probably put it down to maybe 0.15, which is, as you can see, is quite a lot. And as you when you hit play, it takes a while to simulate. So for doing the tutorial right now, I'm going to leave it. I'm going to put it at 0.3, just because it's, it's fairly quick. So yes, anyway, here's the velocity ramp. So at the moment, it is set to visualize the velocity, which is what I was mentioning before. So when it changes color, that's to indicate the speed that the particles are moving, the velocity. And so you can change those colors. You just double click, change whatever color you want. I'm gonna leave it at like a light blue. It's fine. So you can also drop this down and just change, This doesn't affect the render output color. This is just to visualize how fast each particle is moving, just so that you know what your dynamics are doing. So once you've done that, you can see you've got this wheel, you got particles moving underneath and above, you got it dragging. What I actually tried to do was I went back into the circle object. I went to the transform for the outer circle, and I upped the shear. And as you can see, that warps it into this weird, non-circular shape, almost like a fan-looking thing. And I find if you do that, which way is it spinning? Spinning that way. So if you shear it like that, it actually, these bits here will scoop more water, because by the time they come out, they'll be angled downwards, and I'll show you what I mean in a second. So by the time they breach the water, it's sort of angled downwards, therefore holding more water in there, as opposed to when this is not sheared at all. By the time it comes out of the water, it's still pointing downwards, or it's just flat and it doesn't scoop the water as well. So if you wanted it to scoop a little bit more, you can shear it. I'm not going to do that, just because it doesn't look as, it's not as appealing aesthetically. So anyway, that's the basics of just the fluid simulation. Now what I'm going to do on top of this, so I'm going to go back, I'm going to go into the fluid tank initial, select the fluid tank, and then what I want to do is add some foam and bubbles and splashes and stuff basically. So I'm going to go up here, and I'm going to go back to the particle fluids tab, and I'm going to click on Whitewater, and it's going to ask you to select a fluid, so I'm just going to click on this fluid and hit enter, and it's going to generate spray, bubbles and foam based on the geometry of this fluid that we've created. So as you can see, you've got all of this around the wheel now, which are bubbles and foam generated through the velocity. Now you can come up here and see, you can disable the ones that you want. So say I don't want bubbles, turn off bubbles, and that way you've just got sort of foam. Turn off spray, you've got less spray going on at the top, so it's just foam. I'm actually going to turn that off, and I'm going to turn bubbles on. Bubbles are a lot thicker, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn down the lifespan and turn up the lifespan variance and bring down the advection strength. And that's just basically, that just means that they're going to sit there for less time. So you can see as the wheel turns, makes bubbles like that, and so it's going to push them out a lot. So I'm actually going to bring the lifespan down even more to 0.04, and then just bring that down. I'll go back to the start, I hit play, and so you can see it still generates the bubbles, but they're there for a lot less time. Okay, that's pretty good. In fact, I could probably go less. I'm going to go 0.02 and 0.1 on the variance. The variance basically just means that the bubbles are randomized a little bit more, so they're not all being generated and then dying at the same time. Some might die later or earlier than others. Yeah, okay, that's pretty good. Because I feel like this isn't moving particularly fast, and so there wouldn't be, heaps and heaps of bubbles. It would just be, a generous amount. So then you can see, as you play, this blue bar will fill, and that's basically caching the frames that you're playing, so that when you go to play it back, it doesn't have to simulate the particles again. It doesn't have to simulate the movement and the dynamics, and so it saves those frames in a temporary file. So actually, you can see as I play through, you can see if you watch the bubbles, they sort of seem to flash down the bottom here. I don't know if you can see that. If I go like this, sort of seem to flash a little bit, and that's because they're dying out very, very quickly. I'm actually going to leave that as is, because I think once it's actually rendered, it wouldn't be too big a deal. So if you want to change that and you're in the object tree, you just go to Whitewater Sim, go into that, and click on the Whitewater solver, foam, spray, bubbles, all of that. You can then go to the Whitewater emitter, go to the attributes, and you can bring down the inherent velocity. And what that'll do is, as you can see, when the wheel turns and pushes the particles, that's what creates the bubbles and the foam and all that. So if you bring that down, say 0.2 and radial velocity to let's say 0.06, if you bring that down, it's going to inherit a lot less velocity. And you won't notice too much difference with the foam and the bubbles, but what it does affect most, I find, oops, don't do that, hang on. Sorry, cut those. Don't need that. What I find most is that if you've got spray enabled, and you change this, so if I leave that at 1, and 0.25 as before, I go back, and as I play it, the wheel will kick up spray like this. It will fly into the air like that. Now if you don't want that going as far, but you still want spray, then you come to this Whitewater emitter node and just bring down the inherent velocity, and that'll basically limit the amount that it can be pushed into the air. So I'm going to bring that down to 0.2 and 0.05. Now if we play it again, you'll notice there will still be spray, but it's not going to go nearly as high. See, it's only sort of reaching just above the wheel. And, I want a little bit more than that, so I'm going to go 0.3 and 0.08. Back to the start. Oops, back to the start. Press play. And now you can see the spray is coming off a little bit more, coming up a little bit higher, just a little bit more realistic. And so basically that's all you'll need for creating a water simulation, tank simulation that interacts with a rigid body. You can do that with any rigid body that you've got in there. If you want to have something like a whale coming up out of the water, you just get your whale model, turn it into a static rigid body, animate it, to come up and then back down, and basically just hit play, and as it comes up and it breaches the water, if you've got Whitewater on, it will generate foam and spray and bubbles and whatever you need. And as it comes back down, it'll create splashes, and then, afterwards, even after it's stopped moving, if I can go just past frame 120 here, which is where the wheel stops moving, you can see that even when it stops moving, there's still lots of movement in the water here, because you've made a big splash and you've caused a lot of movement of water, or whatever fluid you want this to be, basically. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go create, no I'm not, sorry. I'm going to go up here somewhere, can't remember where it is. Oh, sorry, up here, yeah, lights and cameras. So I'm going to create a new camera. I'm going to come up here where it says no cam, I'm going to click new camera, and that's going to create a camera out of the view that I was just in. So I'm actually going to delete that camera. I'm going to position this viewport a little bit better to where I want it to be. Okay, then I'm going to go new camera, and it creates a camera from the view. And then that way when you hit render, it shows you through your camera 1, which is that one there. It shows you your tank and your object. In fact, I'm just going to rename this to main camera, just so that we can tell it's definitely the right one. So I'm going to move forward the timeline to here. I'm going to render that, see what that looks like. Okay, so it's very cloudy, as you can see. So you can see underneath the tank there, those are the bubbles that it's creating, and that's all the spray. So I'm actually going to turn that down. So I'm going to go back into the Whitewater, go back into the solver, and the spray, I'm going to bring the lifespan down on the spray. Bubbles, I'm just going to turn off. Foam, depth, in fact no, I've got no foam on, that's interesting. Okay, I'm going to leave the foam off and see what that looks like. So this is just spray, and so it should just be just over the top and on the sides. You shouldn't see too much down below. You will see You should see the differences in the particles though, a little bit, movements. So you can see you've got refraction here caused by the particles and spray. So I'm gonna go back to the object tree, click on the camera and just move it up a little bit and rotate it. Sorry, rotate it down and move it up again. And we're going to go to render, I'm going to go to view and pull the focal length out just a touch and go like that. So you get more of the top in frame here. I'm looking into ways of getting this foam to look, or the spray to look a little bit better. For the moment, I'm gonna turn the spray off and leave the foam on and put the depth at 0.02. Basically, that's just going to mean that it generates foam, and when it floats on the top of the surface, it is very light, and it only sits on the very top. So if I go pause it there, render that frame. Okay, so that's a little bit better. Also, don't forget to save, so I'm just going to save it to my desktop. I'm going to make a new folder called Water Wheel Tutorial. I'm going to call it Water Wheel Tut. Accept. Make sure you save. Good. Before I do that, I'm going to go back to the object tree, come back to the lights and cameras, because at the moment when you render, it's applying default lighting, because I've actually got no lights in the scene, so it's applying default lighting, so it doesn't look too great. So I'm going to stop that there, and you can see you can actually render a section here. If you click on this, it's the render region button. So if you want to just see what this bit looks like, maybe, you know, if you've made some changes to materials or lighting, you can just render that region and see what it looks like. But I don't need to do that right now. What I need to do is I'm actually going to make an area light. Hit enter so that it's centered. And hit T and bring it up like this. And which way is it going? So it's pointing forwards at the moment. So I'm going to bring it out to here. I'm going to move it to the side here. I'm going to rotate it towards the subject, and up here in the attributes I'm going to up the intensity. I'm just going to make it 3 and up the exposure to 1. I'm going to up the intensity to 5. So now when you render, you can see the difference. That's the default lighting, and now you can see, because we've got a light in the scene, you'll see some better shadows, and it will generally look just a bit better. So you can see it there. That's obviously where the light is, because I've put it right at the edge there. So I'm also going to create a point light, hit enter, hit T, and bring it over here, and I'm going to lift it up and put it over here. I'm going to up the intensity of this one as well, as sort of a fill light, with this area light being the key light. So if we hit render now, and so you can see that this is rendering the scene view. What I want is for it to render the camera. So let's go up here and go to output. And so you've got the Mantra IPR here. So that's the render engine. So I'm going to go to rendering and I'm going to hit allow motion blur. And I'm going to make sure render with take is set to main. Make sure the camera that it chooses is main camera instead of camera 1, because camera 1 doesn't exist anymore, so make sure it's main camera. Now if we render with the Mantra IPR, it should use the camera view instead of just this perspective view. And actually something that Jun showed me the other day is that you can click and drag to render certain areas. So there's a lot of black around here, so you can click and drag, get that done quickly, because there's nothing over there, so it renders very quickly. and that way the renderer is focused more on rendering actual materials and objects rather than just darkness. And so you can see with motion blur on, you can see a little bit of it there, depending on how fast it's moving. So that looks pretty good. I'm actually gonna, I think I will add an environment light. So add an environment light and bring the light intensity down so that it's filling up the scene but not overriding these two lights. So if I render that now, again, gonna click and drag to just render all that so that the engine is focused on the subject rather than spending its time rendering nothing. And then you can help sort of speed it up a little bit. You can get it to render specific areas if you want to see them first. And so immediately you can sort of see the whiteness on the edges here, which means that there's a lot of light. And that'll be coming from the environment light that I've added. So if we just let that go, you can still see the highlight here from the area light that I've got, which is good, which basically just means that the environment light isn't overriding this light. It's still there, it's filling out the scene, but it's not so bright that it's, you know, making this light and this other light redundant. You still need these lights to provide highlights and shadows. Okay, so this is finished rendering now, and you can see that it's a lot more filled out. You can see the edges here, very white, very light, and that's because of the environment light, as I said. You know, you can see the bottom of the wheel there in the water. So I think, you know, this is probably a good place to leave it just for this tutorial. You know, in terms of rendering, you know, if I press L, if I go back to the output, actually go to the mantra node here. If you want to render a sequence, you go render frame range. Say I want to go 1 to 120. Oh, okay, so there's a keyframe there. So I'm actually going to go into here and go delete channels, and then type 120, because I only want to go to 120 because that's where my animation stops. Make sure it's on main camera. I've got allow motion blur on. We've got images here, so this is the output. So I'm going to choose a desktop. I'm going to go water wheel tutorial. I'm going to put it there. I'm going to call it example. Accept, and I want it to be an EXR. So I'm going to go open EXR, and I'm just going to type EXR in the end, just in case. And then what we want to do is make sure, because we've got up to 3 digits of frames, I'm going to go in here and type $ capital F and then 3, and that basically that will dot $ capital F3, and that's the frame padding. So that'll make sure that when it creates this image sequence, it creates them, you know, 001, 002, 003, and so on. Because if you don't do that, you'll end up, you know, if it starts at 1, it'll be example 1.exr, example 100.exr, example 101, and the order will be completely messed up. And so you've got to have this frame padding expression in here. 3, so you just, it's $F and then however many zeros you want to add before the frame number. So I want to add, or no, however many digits, sorry. So I want to add 2 digits before the frame number so that it's 001, 002, and then once it gets up to 100, up to 120, it'll just be example.100.exr. You know, if you were going to 1,000, obviously you'd put 4, and so on. But you know, not going that far. So enter on that, and that just makes sure that's going to be the file name essentially, and that'll be the number. And then so I've got it set. I've got my directory set. Got my file type. Got my file name. Very easy. Make sure you got render frame range, and then just render to disk. The output goes, you know, to wherever you saved it, and then you import the image sequence into, you know, Premiere, After Effects, Final Cut, whatever software you want to use to export the image sequence as a video. And then that's basically it. You can add as many different lights and materials and things, which I'm not going to go over, but add as many of those as you want, and then you've got your water simulation. So I'm going to save this, then I'm going to create a new file. Okay, so it's very easy. So I'm just going to create a grid, hit enter, hit E, scale it up quite a bit, easy, and make a sphere, because that's the object. I want to turn it to liquid, press E, scale that up as well. I'm going to lift that up so that it's falls and splashes. And in fact, I'm just gonna add a couple just random boxes, because I don't know, just gives it something interesting to interact with. I'm just gonna move that there, Control C, Control V, put that one over there, say. Okay, so I'm going to select this grid, I'm going to come up to collisions, click static object, I'm going to do the same with the two boxes. Then I'm going to click on this sphere, I'm going to come up to particle fluids and click flip fluid from object, and that's going to turn it into particle geometry. So it's now a fluid. So now if you hit play, you're like, great, it's a fluid, it's going to hit the surface and it's going to disperse, except it doesn't, it goes right through. Now the reason that is that because it's trying to recognize a volume, but we need it to recognize the grid as a surface instead. So we're going to go into this auto.network and click on the grid here, and then come down to collisions, and the collision detection, change that to surface collisions. Now I actually haven't tried this, but if we use a cube, is it going to... Okay, so cubes, the default is a volume collision, which is fine for a cube, but for a grid isn't a volume, basically. It's just a surface. And so now, if I've done it on the right object, grid, surface collisions, yep. So now I've hit play. As you hit play and as it hits, it will disperse. You notice it'll collide with the box here, and collide with this box here, and just disperse like that. And you can actually change the way that this looks. If you don't want to view it as particles, you can view it as a polygon soup, basically. So if you click on the object fluid and click on the surface preview, you can then visualize the velocity, same as before. So if you change this to polygon soup, it'll look more like liquid. Kind of looks weird, but that's how it should look. Obviously it takes a little bit longer to compute. Even if it does cache, it still has to sort of simulate each time, which is a bit frustrating, but it's just how it is. So what I'm actually going to do is go out of this. I'm going to leave it as particles. I'm going to go out of this. I'm going to click on this box. I'm going to move it in a little bit, just so that it hits the box before dispersing too much. Hit play. Now it should disperse, bounce off the box like that. It bounces up quite high, as you can see there. So now if I go back to the object fluid, change it to polygon soup, you can see it just climbs up the box like that, which is pretty cool. So I'm going to create a camera here, like this. And then if we go back to fluid, okay, leave that as particles. And I'm going to render that. So again, it's using the default lighting, so it's not going to be fantastic, but it's there. It's climbed up the box there, and it's all over the ground. So I'm going to add a light, point light, enter, T, lift it up like this, and just up the intensity so that it's radiating right from the center. Actually, no, I don't want to do that. I'm going to backlight it. I'm going to backlight it like that. And then I'm going to add an area light, enter, hit T, bring it up, bring it back. And then that's probably all. And then you can rotate the cone like that. And then if I hit play, make sure, of course, real time is on, otherwise you'll get what just happened and it dropped really quickly. So now you can see it in real time. So I'm going to get it there, let's say. I'm going to render this bit here. In fact, if I go looking through the camera and hit render, so the lighting's a lot more dynamic. You see shadows, see refraction, reflection, a lot better. And it's just as easy as that. So that's turning an object into a liquid. If you want it in that specific shape, you know, if you've got a model that you want, I don't know, say, I'm trying to think of a good example. I can't. But anyway, that's how you do it. Very easy, very quick.